Hello, my name is Anton Picari. In January of this year, 2024, the Bulletin for the Atomic Scientists once again placed the Doomsday Clock 90 seconds to midnight, the closest our species has ever been to doomsday, extinction. The World Wildlife Fund, the Stanford Report, and other organizations and scholars have also pointed out that the threat of doomsday looms as the sixth mass extinction occurs. Doomsday is 90 seconds away while the sixth mass extinction is here. The two threats to our species' survival is global warming and nuclear war. Both threats to human survival are in the front pages of the majority of mass media outlets. Not nearly enough, but these issues do make the headlines occasionally. As Raymond Pierre Humboldt stated, it's time to panic about climate change. I add an addendum. It's time to panic about climate change and nuclear war. Noam Chomsky wrote, "Discussing our unfree press half a century ago, John Dewey observed that criticism of specific abuses has only limited value. The only real fundamental approach to the problem is to inquire concerning the necessary effect of the present economic system upon the whole system of publicity, upon the judgment of what news is, upon the selection and elimination of matter that is published, upon the treatment of news in both editorial and news columns. The question under this mode of approach is not how many specific abuses there are and how they may be remedied, but how far genuine intellectual freedom and social responsibility are possible on any large scale under the existing economic regime. To address global warming and nuclear war, the two threats to the survival of the human species, we must look at the existing economic system. In our democracy, does the existing economic system serve the people, the majority of the population, or the few? Who makes the major decisions in the economic, social, and political arena? If this is truly a democracy, the majority of the population make the major decisions in the economic, social, and political arena. Or do an elite few make the major decisions in the economic, social, and political arena? To answer these questions, I have turned to three books by Noam Chomsky: Deterring Democracy, Hegemony or Survival, and Profit Over People. Everything from here on out will be a direct quote from one of these books. Class is in session, Chomsky style. Over the years, popular forces have sought to gain a larger share in managing their affairs, with some successes alongside many defeats. Meanwhile, an instructive body of thought has been developed to justify elite resistance to democracy. In considering the first principles of government, David Hume found nothing more surprising than to see the easiness with which the many are governed by the few, and to observe the implicit submission with which men resign their own sentiments and passions to those of their rulers. When we inquire by what means this wonder is brought about, we shall find that force is always on the side of the governed, and governors have nothing to support them but opinion. 'Tis therefore on opinion only that government is founded, and this maxim extends to the most despotic and most military governments as well as to the most free and most popular. A more accurate version is that the more free and popular a government, the more it becomes necessary to rely on control of the opinion to ensure submission to the rulers. In a democracy, the governed have the right to consent, but nothing more than that. In the terminology of modern progressive thought, the population may be spectators, but not participants, apart from occasional choices among leaders representing authentic power, what we would call elections. We just had an election where we had the choice among leaders representing authentic power. That is the political arena. The general population must be excluded entirely from the economic arena, where what happens in society is largely determined. His insights, David Hume's, explains why elites are so dedicated to indoctrination and thought control, a major and largely neglected theme of modern history. And if the state lacks the force to coerce and the voice of the people can be heard, it is necessary to ensure that the voice says the right thing, as respected intellectuals have been advising for many years. This thesis was put forth a century earlier by advocates of the rule of Parliament against the king, but more significantly against the people, that the power of the sword is and ever hath been the foundation of all titles to government. The historical norm is illustrated by the dramatically contrasting case of Central America, where any popular effort to overthrow the brutal tyrannies of the oligarchy and military is met with murderous force, supported or directly organized by the ruler of the hemisphere, the United States. 10 years ago, there were signs of hope for an end to the dark ages of terror and misery, with the rise of self-help groups, unions, peasant associations, Christian-based communities, and other popular organizations that might have led the way to democracy and social reform. This prospect elicited a stern response by the United States and its clients, generally supported by its European allies, with a campaign of slaughter, torture, and general barbarism that left societies affected by terror and panic, collective intimidation and generalized fear, and internalized acceptance of the terror, in the words of a church-based Salvadoran human rights organization. David Hume's insight has been revived and elaborated, but with a crucial innovation. Control of thought is more important for governments that are free and popular than for despotic and military states. The logic is straightforward. A despotic state can control its domestic enemy by force, but as the state loses this weapon, other devices are required to prevent the ignorant masses from interfering with public affairs, which are none of their business. The problem of putting the public in its place came to the fore with what one historian calls the first great outburst of democratic thought in history, the English Revolution in the 17th century, in the 1650s. The awakening of the general populace raised the problem of how to contain the threat. The libertarian ideas of the radical Democrats were considered outrageous by respectable people. They favored universal education, guaranteed health care, and democratization of the law, which one described the law as a fox with poor men the geese. He pulls off their feathers and feeds upon them. They developed a kind of libertarian theology, which, as one critic ominously observed, preached seditious doctrine to the people and aimed to raise the rascal multitude against all men of best quality in the kingdom, to draw them into associations and combinations with one another, against all lords, gentry, ministers, lawyers, rich and peaceable men, historian Clement Walker said. Particularly frightening were the itinerant workers and preachers calling for freedom and democracy, the agitators stirring up the rascal multitude, and the printers putting out pamphlets questioning authority and its mysteries. There can be no form of government without its proper mysteries, Clement Walker warned, mysteries that must be concealed from the common folk. Ignorance and admiration arising from ignorance are the parents of civil devotion and obedience, a thought echoed by Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor. The radical Democrats had cast all the mysteries and secrets of government before the vulgar like pearls before swine, Clement Walker continued, and had made the people thereby so curious and so arrogant that they will never find humility enough to submit to a civil rule. It is dangerous, another commentator ominously observed, to have a people know their own strength. The rabble did not want to be ruled by king or by parliament, but by countrymen like ourselves that know our wants. Their pamphlets explain further that it will never be a good world while knights and gentlemen make us laws that are chosen for fear and do but oppress us and do not know the people's sores. They were willing to grant the people rights, but within reason, and on the principle that when we mention the people, we do not mean the confused, promiscuous body of the people. After the Democrats had been defeated, John Locke commented that day laborers and tradesmen, the spinsters and dairymaids, must be told what to believe. The greatest part cannot know, and therefore they must believe. And the libertarian rabble dispersed. Censorship was permitted to lapse in England because the opinion formers censored themselves. Nothing got into print which frightened the men of property, Christopher Hill comments. In a well-functioning state capitalist democracy like the United States, what might frighten the men of property is generally kept far from the public eye, sometimes with quite astonishing success. The essential professional task and responsibility of the intellectual community is to shape the perceived historical record and the picture of the contemporary world in the interests of the powerful, thus ensuring that the public, properly bewildered, keeps to its place and function. In the 1650s, the radical Democrats, the mass of the people, were described as a giddy multitude, beasts in men's shapes. It is proper to suppress them, just as it is proper to save the life of a lunatic or distracted person even against his will, if the people are so depraved and corrupt as to confer places of power and trust upon wicked and undeserving men. They forfeit their power in this behalf unto those that are good, though but a few. Henry Kissinger once provided the insight that the few were the intellectuals who qualify as experts because they articulate the consensus of the powerful. They manage the business empires, ideological institutions, and political structures, or serve at them at various levels. Their task is to shepherd the bewildered herd and keep the giddy multitude in a state of implicit submission, and thus to bar the dreaded prospect of freedom and self-determination. The founding fathers repeated the sentiments of the British men of best quality in almost the same words. As one put it, when I mention the public, I mean to include only the rational part of it. The ignorant and vulgar are as unfit to judge of the modes of government as they are unable to manage its reins, John Randolph of Virginia said in 1774. His colleague, John Randolph of Virginia, the colleague of John Randolph of Virginia, Alexander Hamilton, declared that the people are a great beast that must be tamed. After the American Revolution, rebellious and independent farmers had to be taught by force that the ideals expressed in the pamphlets of 1776 were not to be taken seriously. The common people were not to be represented by countrymen like themselves that know the people's sores, but by gentry, merchants, lawyers, and others who hold or serve private power. Jefferson and Madison believed that power should be in the hands of the natural aristocracy, Edmund Morgan comments. Men like themselves who would defend property rights against Alexander Hamilton's paper aristocracy, and from the poor. They, being Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, regarded slaves, paupers, and destitute laborers as an ever-present danger to liberty as well as property. It was expressed by the Founding Fathers that the people who own the country ought to govern it. This was said by the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and Founding Father John Jay. The people who own the country ought to govern it. It resembled what Adam Smith had said, that the principal architects of policy in England were the merchants and manufacturers, whose interests were peculiarly attended to by policies, no matter the grievous impact on the population of England. The United States is as close to the ideal case of a state capitalist democracy as can be found. The main designer, furthermore, was an astute political thinker, James Madison, whose views largely prevailed. In the debate on the Constitution, Madison pointed out that if elections in England were open to all classes of people, the property of landed proprietors would be insecure. An agrarian law would soon take place, giving land to the landless. The constitutional system must be designed to prevent such injustice and secure the permanent interests of the country, which are property rights. Among Madisonian scholars, there is a consensus that the Constitution was intrinsically an aristocratic document designed to check the democratic tendencies of the period, delivering power to a better sort of people and excluding those who are not rich, well-born, or prominent from exercising political power, Lance Banning wrote. The primary responsibility of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority, James Madison declared. That has been the guiding principle of the democratic system from its origins until today. In public discussion, James Madison spoke of the rights of minorities in general, but it is quite clear that he had a particular minority in mind, the minority of the opulent. The Madisonian principle, then, is that government must guard the rights of persons generally, but must provide special and additional guarantees for the rights of one class of persons, property owners. Madison foresaw that the threat of democracy was likely to become more severe over time because of the increase in the proportion of those who will labor under all the hardships of life and secretly sigh for a more equal distribution of its blessings. They might gain influence, Madison feared. He was concerned by the symptoms of leveling spirit that had already appeared and warned of the future danger. If the right to vote would place power over property in hands without a share in it, those without property or the hope of acquiring it cannot be expected to sympathize sufficiently with its rights, James Madison explained. His solution was to keep political power in the hands of those who come from and represent the wealth of the nation, the more capable set of men, with the general public fragmented and disorganized. These more capable set of men who were supposed to represent the wealth of the nation were seen in the rise of corporations in the 19th century and the legal structures devised to grant them dominance over private and public life. A persistent concern of Western elites is that popular organizations might lay the basis for a meaningful democracy and social reform, threatening the prerogatives of the privileged. Those who seek to raise the rascal multitude and draw them into associations and combinations with one another against the men of best quality must therefore be repressed or eliminated. It comes as no surprise that Archbishop Oscar Romero should be assassinated shortly after urging President Jimmy Carter to withhold military aid from the governing junta, which he warned would use it to sharpen injustice and repression against the people's organizations struggling for respect in their most basic human rights. The threat of popular organization to privilege is real enough in itself. Worse still, the rot may spread in the terminology of political elites. There may be a demonstration effect of independent development in a form that attends to the people's sores. As noted earlier, internal documents and even the public record reveal that a driving concern of U.S. planners has been the fear that the virus might spread, infecting regions beyond. This is the language of National Security Advisor and former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, feared that if the Bolshevik disease were to spread, it would leave the ignorant and incapable mass of humanity dominant on the earth. The Bolsheviks, he continued, were appealing to the proletariat of all countries, to the ignorant and mentally deficient, who by their numbers are urged to become masters, a very real danger in view of the process of social unrest throughout the world. Again, it is democracy that is the awesome threat. With these dire consequences in mind, the Western invasion of the Soviet Union in 1917 was justified on defensive grounds against the revolution's challenge to the very survival of the capitalist order, John Lewis Gaddis wrote. And it was only natural that the defense of the United States should extend from invasion of the Soviet Union to Wilson's Red Scare at home. As Robert Lansing explained, force must be used to prevent the leaders of Bolshevism and anarchy from proceeding to organize or preach against government in the United States. The government must not permit these fanatics to enjoy the liberty which they now seek to destroy. The repression launched by the Wilson administration successfully undermined democratic politics unions, freedom of the press, and independent thought, in the interests of corporate power and the state authorities who represented its interests, all with the approval of the media and elites generally, all in self-defense against the ignorant and mentally deficient majority. Much of the same story was reenacted after World War II, again under the pretext of a Soviet threat, in reality to restore submission to the rulers. It is often not appreciated how profound and deeply rooted is the contempt for democracy in the elite culture, and the fear it arouses. When political life and independent thought revived in the 1960s, the problem arose again, and the reaction was the same. The Trilateral Commission, founded by John D. Rockefeller, brought together liberal elites from Europe, Japan, and the United States. The Trilateral Commission warned of an impending crisis of democracy as segments of the public sought to enter the political arena. This excess of democracy was posing a threat to the unhampered rule of privileged elites, what is called democracy in political theology. The problem was the usual one. The rabble were trying to arrange their own affairs, gaining control over their communities, and pressing their political demands. There were organizing efforts among young people, ethnic minorities, women, social activists, and others, encouraged by the struggles of benighted masses elsewhere for freedom and independence. More moderation and democracy would be required, the Trilateral Commission concluded. Perhaps a return to the days when Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers, as the American rapporteur Samuel Huntington, the Harvard professor, commented. In case you didn't know, President Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers. And it was once again the job of institutions like schools, universities, and churches to indoctrinate the youth. The actual phrase they used was churches, universities, and schools were responsible for the indoctrination of the youth. The Trilateral Commission's phrase, not mine. These ideas were expressed by the influential moralist and foreign affairs advisor Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr wrote that rationality belongs to the cool observers, while the common person follows not reason but faith. The cool observers, Niebuhr explained, must recognize the stupidity of the average man and must provide the necessary illusion in the emotionally potent oversimplifications that will keep the naive simpletons on course. As in 1650, it remains necessary to protect the lunatic or distracted person, the ignorant rabble, from their own depraved and corrupt judgments, just as one does not allow a child to cross the street without supervision. In accordance with the prevailing conceptions, there is no infringement of democracy if a few corporations control the information system. In fact, when a few corporations control the information system, that is the essence of democracy. The leading figure of the public relations industry, the father of public relations, Edward Bernays, explained, the very essence of the democratic process is the freedom to persuade and suggest, what he calls the engineering of consent. If the freedom to persuade happens to be concentrated in a few hands, we must recognize that such is the nature of a free society. Since the early 20th century, the public relations industry has devoted huge resources to educating the American people about the economic facts of life to ensure a favorable climate for business. Its task, as an AT&T executive observed 80 years ago, is to control the public mind, which is the only serious danger confronting the company. Edward Bernays expressed the basic point in a 1928 public relations manual titled Propaganda. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in a democratic society. It is the intelligent minorities which need to make use of propaganda continuously and systematically. Given its enormous and decisive power, the highly class-conscious business community of the United States has been able to put these lessons to effective use. Edward Bernays' advocacy of propaganda is cited by Thomas McCann, the head of public relations for the United Fruit Company, for which Edward Bernays provided signal service in preparing the ground for the overthrow of Guatemalan democracy in 1954. A major triumph of business propaganda with the willing compliance of the media. Before the US-backed Guatemalan coup in 1954, in 1952, the CIA warned that the radical and nationalist policies of the Guatemalan government had gained the support or acquiescence of almost all Guatemalans. The government was mobilizing the hitherto politically inerrant peasantry and creating mass support for the present regime by means of labor organization, agrarian reform, and other policies identified with the revolution of 1944, which had aroused a strong national movement to free Guatemala from the military dictatorship, social backwardness, and economic colonialism, which had been the pattern of the past. Leading this revolution was Jacobo Arbenz. The policies of the democratic government of Jacobo Arbenz inspired the loyalty and conformed to the self-interest of most politically conscious Guatemalans. State Department intelligence reported that the democratic leadership of Jacobo Arbenz insisted upon the maintenance of an open political system, thus allowing communists to expand their operations and appeal effectively to various sectors of the population. These deficiencies of democracy were cured by the Eisenhower-supported military coup of 1954 in Guatemala and the reign of terror since, always with the large-scale U.S. support. The Eisenhower-approved military coup of 1954 in Guatemala was the catalyst to what became the silent genocide in Guatemala. A silent genocide that would end up stealing the lives of 150,000 Guatemalan people that the United States was primarily responsible for. The brutal and murderous military coup in Brazil in 1964 was welcomed by John F. Kennedy's ambassador, Lincoln Gordon, as a democratic rebellion, indeed the most decisive victory of freedom in the mid-20th century. A former Harvard University economist, Lincoln Gordon, added that this victory of freedom, that is the violent overthrow of a parliamentary democracy in a brutal coup, should create a greatly improved climate for private investments, giving some further insight into the operative meaning of the terms freedom and democracy. Freedom and democracy meaning an improved climate for private investments by U.S. investors and corporations. 2 years later, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara informed his associates that U.S. policy towards Latin American military have on the whole been effective in attaining the goals set for them. These policies had improved internal security capabilities and established predominant U.S. military influence. The Latin American military understood their tasks and are equipped to pursue them thanks to President Kennedy's programs of military aid and training. These tasks included the overthrow of civilian governments whenever, in the judgment of the military, the conduct of democratic leaders is injurious to the welfare of the nation. Such action by the military are necessary in the Latin American cultural environment the Kennedy intellectuals explained. And we can be confident that they will be carried out properly now that the military have gained an understanding of and orientation toward U.S. objectives that assures a proper outcome to the revolutionary struggle for power among major groups which constitute the present class structure in Latin America, an outcome that will protect U.S. investment and trade, the economic root that is at the heart of U.S. political interest in Latin America. So now you know the protection of private U.S. investment and trade is the economic root that is at the heart of U.S. political interest in Latin America, and is the reason why we are able to support so many dictatorships in Latin America. The national security states installed and backed by the United States are discussed in an important book by Lars Schultz, one of the leading Latin American scholars. Their goal, the national security states installed and backed by the United States, in his words, was to destroy permanently a perceived threat to the existing structure of socio-economic privilege by eliminating the political participation of the numerical majority, Alexander Hamilton's great beast. In the 1950s, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles informed the National Security Council the United States is hopelessly far behind the Soviets in developing controls over the minds and emotions of unsophisticated peoples. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and President Eisenhower expressed their concern over the communist ability to gain control of mass movements, an ability that we have no capacity to duplicate. The poor people are the ones the communists appeal to, and they have always wanted to plunder the rich. In other words, we find it hard to induce the people to accept our doctrine that the rich should plunder the poor, a public relations problem that had not yet been solved. Woodrow Wilson's own view was that an elite of gentlemen with elevated ideals is needed to preserve stability and righteousness. At home, it is necessary to safeguard a system of elite decision-making and public ratification, polyarchy in the terminology of political science, not democracy. It is the intelligent minority of responsible men who must control decision-making. Another veteran of Wilson's propaganda committee, Walter Lippmann, explained in his influential essays on democracy. Walter Lippmann was also the most respected guru in U.S. journalism and a noted commentator on public affairs for half a century. Walter Lippmann described a revolution in the practice of democracy as the manufacture of consent has become a self-conscious art and popular organ of popular government. This is a natural development when public opinion cannot be trusted. In the presence of institutions in education by which the environment is so successfully reported that the realities of public life stand out very sharply against self-centered opinion. The common interests very largely elude public opinion entirely and can be managed only by a specialized class whose personal interests reach beyond the locality and thus are able to receive the realities. These are men of best quality who alone are capable of political and economic management. It follows that two political roles must be clearly distinguished, Lippmann goes on to explain. First, there is the role assigned to the specialized class, the insiders, the responsible men, who have access to information and understanding. Ideally, they should have a special education for public office and should master the criteria for solving the problems of society. The public men are therefore to lead opinion and take responsibility for the formation of a sound public opinion. They initiate, they administer, they settle, and should be protected from ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, the general public, who are incapable of dealing with the substance of the problem. The second role is the task of the public, those ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, which is much more limited. It is not for the public, Walter Lippmann observes, to pass judgment on the intrinsic merits of an issue or to offer analysis or solutions, but merely on occasion to place its force at the disposal of one or another group of responsible men, what we would call elections. The public does not reason, investigate, invent, persuade, bargain, or settle. Rather, the public acts only by aligning itself as the partisan of someone in a position to act executively. Once he has given the matter at hand sober and disinterested thought, it is for this reason that the public must be put in its place. The bewildered herd, trampling and roaring, has its function to be the interested spectators of action, not participants. Participation is the duty of responsible men, the men of best quality. There is clearly enough and an unspoken assumption behind the proposal of Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays, and others. The specialized class are offered the opportunity to manage public affairs by virtue of their subordination to those with real power. In our society, dominant business interests, a crucial fact that is ignored in the self-praise of the elect. So now we know who real power is: dominant business interests. 15 years later, the influential political scientist Harold Lasswell, and one of the founder of political science, said that when elites lack the requisite force to compel obedience, social managers must turn to a whole new technique of control, largely through propaganda. Harold Lasswell added, "The conventional justification. We must recognize the ignorance and stupidity of the masses and not succumb to democratic dogmatisms about men being the best judges of their own interests. They are not, and we must control them for their own good." The same principle guides the business community. The doctrines of Walter Lippmann, Harold Lasswell, and Edward Bernays are entirely natural in any society in which power is narrowly concentrated, but formal mechanisms exist by which ordinary people may, in theory, play some role in shaping their own affairs. A threat that plainly must be barred. The techniques of manufacture of consent are most finely honed in the United States, a more advanced business-run society than its allies, and one that is in important ways more free than elsewhere, so that the ignorant and stupid masses are more dangerous. The basic problem recognized throughout is that as the state loses the capacity to control the population by force, privileged sectors must find other methods to ensure that the rascal multitude is removed from the public arena, and that insignificant nations must be subject to the same problems as insignificant people, unpeople. A properly functioning system of indoctrination has a variety of tasks, some rather delicate. One of its targets is the stupid and ignorant masses. They must be kept that way, diverted with emotionally potent oversimplifications, marginalized and isolated. Ideally, each person should be alone, in front of the television screen, watching sports, soap operas, or comedies, deprived of organizational structures that permit individuals lacking resources to discover what they think and believe in with interaction with others. The rascal multitude are the proper targets of the mass media in a public education system geared to obedience and training and needed skills, including the skill of repeating patriotic slogans on timely occasions. For submissiveness to become a reliable trait, it must be entrenched in every realm. The public are to be observers, not participants, consumers of ideology as well as products. Eduardo Galeano writes that the majority must resign itself to the consumption of fantasy. Illusions of wealth are sold to the poor, illusions of freedom to the oppressed, dreams of victory to the defeated, and power to the weak. Like Adam Smith and other founders of classical liberalism, James Madison was pre-capitalist and an anti-capitalist in spirit. He expected that the rulers would be enlightened statesmen and benevolent philosophers whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of their country. James Madison soon learned differently as the opulent minority proceeded to use their newfound power as much as Adam Smith had predicted a few years earlier. They were intent on pursuing what Smith called the vile maxim of the masters of mankind, all for ourselves and nothing for other people. By 1792, Madison warned that the rising developmental capitalist state was substituting the motive of private interest in place of public duty, leading to a real domination of the few under an apparent liberty of the many. He deplored the daring depravity of the times as private powers became the Praetorian band of the government, at once its tools and its tyrant, bribed by its largesses and overawing by its clamors and combinations. They cast over society the shadow that we call politics, as John Dewey later commented. One of the major 20th century philosophers and a leading figure of North American liberalism, John Dewey emphasized that democracy has little content when big business rules the life of the country through its control of the means of production, exchange, publicity, transportation, and communications, reinforced by command of the press, press agents, and other means of publicity and propaganda. John Dewey held further that in a free and democratic society, workers must be the masters of their own industrial fate, not tools rented by employers, ideas that can be traced back to classical liberalism and the Enlightenment, and have constantly reappeared in popular struggle in the United States as elsewhere. Like when the labor press in the early 20th century wrote, "Those who work in the mills ought to own the mills." There have been many changes in the past 200 years, but Madison's views of warning have only become more appropriate taking new meaning with the establishment of great private tyrannies, corporations, that were granted extraordinary powers early in the century, primarily by the courts. Corporations are private tyrannies because they are not only unaccountable, but they have a rigid hierarchy in which those, or the person at the top, gives the orders, and everyone else at the bottom takes the orders. And those at the very bottom rung of the ladder are allowed to rent themselves out in order to work. That's called having a job. In the 1870s, it was actually not only a well-known platform of the Republican Party, but it was written in the New York Times that wage labor amounted to wage slavery. And so those at the bottom rung of the corporation have the option of renting them out to survive. Their other option is either rent themselves out in order to survive and get a wage, or starve. State capitalist democracy has a certain tension with regard to the locus of power. In principle, the people rule, but effective power resides largely in private hands, with large-scale effects throughout the social order. Unless the rich and powerful are satisfied, everyone will suffer, because they control the basic social levers, determining what will be produced and consumed and what crumbs will filter down to their subjects. For the homeless in the streets, then, the primary objective is to ensure that the rich live happily in their mansions. This crucial factor, along with simple control over resources, severely limits the force on the side of the governed, and diminishes Hume's paradox in a well-functioning capitalist democracy in which the general public is scattered and isolated. Understanding of these basic conditions, tacit or explicit, has long served as a guide for policy, both domestic and foreign. Once popular organizations are dispersed or crushed and decision-making power is firmly in the hands of owners and managers, democratic forms are quite acceptable, even preferable, as a device of legitimation of elite rule in a business-run democracy. Here we have the main obstacles to addressing the threats to human survival: global warming and nuclear war. That democracy in its current form is a device of legitimation of elite rule in a business-run democracy. Which is to say that we don't have much of a democracy at all, besides what those who own the country pay lip service to. And to truly approach and start to fight against the twin threats of our survival, as Noam Chomsky calls them, global warming and nuclear war, we not only need to educate ourselves about how our economic, political, and social arena functions, but primarily who it functions for, which, as Noam Chomsky does a great job of pointing out in his books, Deterring Democracy, Profit Over People, and Hegemony or Survival, those our democracy works for is the elite few who have concentrated wealth and power. And if we mean to have any form of legitimate survival or any form of survival that we humans enjoy presently against the imminent threats of nuclear war and global warming, we will need to confront the elite rule that controls our economic, political, and social arena, our democracy. It is in this challenge that we are presented with that one of our first modes of resistance will be the simple mode of education, educating those around us and educating those on YouTube. If you've made it this far, I thank you for listening, and I will remind you, as Noam Chomsky said, resistance is an obligation. But he also said our guiding principle should be love.